The piercing howl shattered the winter silence as flames engulfed Whispering Pines' elderly residents trapped by the raging forest fire, watched in disbelief as four massive timber wolves emerged from the tree line. Led by Sophie Carter, the same wolves that townspeople had once hunted and feared were now their only hope for survival. Navigating through smoke-filled paths no human could find, they remember, Sophie whispered as North the Silverback Alpha led the way. They remember everything 15. Years earlier, a 10-year-old Sophie had pulled 4 drowning wolf cubs from the icy Cedar River during Montana's worst spring flood. Against her community's wishes facing threats and ridicule, she raised them in secret until they escaped into the wilderness. No one could have imagined they would return in the town's darkest hour, nor that the bond between a child and 4 orphan wolves would save dozens of lives and transform communities. Understanding of the wild creatures they had feared for. Generations. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Whispering Pines wasn't just another on a Montana map. Nestled between ancient mountains and sprawling forests, the town had built its identity around a century-old tradition. A wolf hunting the town square proudly displayed a bronze statue of the settlement's founder, rifle in hand, foot resting triumphantly on a wolf carcass. Each November, the community celebrated Hunters' Festival, where oldtimers recounted tales of the wolf menace, while younger men prepared for the annual hunt. In Whispering Pines, wolves weren't just animals. They were symbols of the wilderness that the town's people had fought to tame since their ancestors first settled the valley in 1887. Every child grew up learning that wolves were cunning, killers, threats to livestock, pets, and even children who strayed too far. Into the trees, a taxidermy shop on Main Street displayed 24 preserved wolf heads, their glass eyes frozen in an eternal predator stare. 10-year-old Sophie Carter had always been an outsider in this close-knit community. Orphaned at 7, when her parents' car plunged off Mountain Pass Road during a blizzard, she'd been raised by her grandmother Helen, a silver-haired woman whose arthritic fingers still managed to bake the best apple pies in the county. Unlike other children who played in supervised yards, Sophie spent hours exploring the forest edges alone. Some towns people whispered that the child was touched after surviving the crash that took her parents. She rarely spoke above a whisper, preferred the company of wildlife to other children, and had an unnerving habit of staring into the forest, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Helen defended her fiercely, but worried privately about the girl's future in a community that valued conformity above all else. The little wooden house they shared at the edge of town seemed to exist in a world of its own, much like its inhabitants. The day that changed everything began like any other spring morning. Sophie had slipped away from the house at dawn, while Helen slept a peanut butter sandwich tucked in her pocket. For breakfast, the 10-year-old navigated the forest edge with the confidence of someone much older, her small boots leaving barely any trace on the damp earth. She had a secret spot, a fallen oak that created a natural bridge across Cedar River, where deer often came to drink in the early hours. Sophie could sit motionless for longer than most adults. Her patience rewarded with glimpses of woodland creatures that few villagers ever saw that morning. However, the forest felt different. The usual bird song was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on Sophie's arm stand up. Then she heard a rushing, roaring sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Sophie moved toward the sound, drawn by curiosity and concern. As she neared Cedar River, she gasped at the sight before her. The normally gentle stream had transformed into a raging torrent, swollen by spring snowmelt and overnight rain. Trees that had stood peacefully along the banks for decades were now partially submerged, the water rising visibly. Even as she watched, something caught her eye: movement in the churning water. At first, she thought it was just debris being carried downstream, but then she saw it clearly: a small, dark form struggling against the current, trying desperately to keep its head above water. A puppy, Sophie whispered, moving closer to the riverbank. But as the creature was swept nearer, she realized it wasn't a dog at all. The distinctive pointed ears and elongated snout were unmistakable. A wolf cub, barely old enough to have opened its eyes before Sophie could process this realization. She spotted another cub, and then another, and finally a fourth, all being carried helplessly down the raging river. Without hesitation, Sophie scrambled LED down the muddy bank. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was dangerous, both the flood and the wolf cubs. But something stronger drove her forward. Hold on, she called, though she knew the cubs couldn't understand. She went into the shallows, the ice-cold water immediately soaking through her jeans. The first cub was swept directly toward her, and Sophie lunged, catching with both hands and lifting It high above the water, the tiny creature trembled violently in her grasp as for soaked and eyes wide with terror. Sophie quickly placed it on the bank, then turned back to the river. The second cub was farther out, requiring Sophie to wade deeper until the water reached her waist. Come on, she urged, as the current pulled at her legs with a desperate reach. She managed to grab the second cub by the scruff of its neck. This one was larger, with dark gray fur that appeared almost black when wet by. Now Sophie was shivering almost as badly as the cubs, but she couldn't stop. The third cub had become caught in a tangle of branches midstream. Sophie struggled against the current, her feet slipping on the muddy riverbed as she made her way toward it. "I'm coming," she called to the whimpering animal. "Just hold on a little longer." The branch holding the cub snapped. Just as Sophie reached it, she lunged forward, falling face first into the freezing water, but managing to secure the cub against her chest. As she flailed back to the surface, sputtering and gasping, three down, one to go. The fourth and smallest cub had been swept farther downstream. Sophie scrambled along the bank, clutching the third cub in her arms. She spotted the tiny form clinging desperately to a rock in the middle of the river, its strength clearly failing. "Please don't let go," Sophie whispered. She set down the third cub next to its siblings and looked frantically around for something to help her reach the stranded fourth. The fallen oak that normally bridged the river was now half submerged, but it still extended partway across. Sophie climbed onto the slippery trunk, arms outstretched for balance. As she inched her way over the raging water, the smallest cub saw her approaching and let out a pitiful sound that tore at Sophie's heart. "I'm almost there," she encouraged, though her voice shook with cold and fear. When the log wouldn't take her any closer, Sophie lay flat on her stomach and stretched her arm as far as it would go. "Come on, little one," just a little closer. The cub seemed to understand. With final desperate effort, it released the rock and paddled towards Sophie's outstretched hand. The current immediately began to pull it away, but Sophie's fingers closed around its tiny body at the last possible moment. "Got you," she cried in triumph, carefully backing up along the log until she reached solid ground. The fourth cub was barely moving, much smaller than its siblings and dangerously cold. Sophie gathered all four cubs and tucked them inside her jacket, zipping it up so that only their heads poked out. Their combined weight nearly toppled her as she began the upward trek back home, her clothes soaking wet in her teeth. Chattering, "You're going to be okay," she murmured to the trembling bundle. "I promise." Helen Carter was standing on the porch when Sophie emerged from the forest, her expression changing from worry to shock as she saw her granddaughter's bedraggled state. "Sophie and Carter, where on earth have you been? I've been worried sick, Gran. I need help." Sophie said, her voice urgent as she opened her jacket to reveal the four wolf cubs. They were drowning in the river. Their mother was nowhere around. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord have mercy, are those what I think they are?" "Wolf cubs," Sophie confirmed. "The river's flooding. They would have died, and you could haven't died trying to save them." Helen's voice rose with delayed panic as she realized what her granddaughter must have done. "The river is dangerous enough when it's calm, let alone during spring flood. I had to help them." Gran, Sophie said, simply looking down at the cubs with such tenderness that Helen felt her resolve weakening despite herself. "Sophie, you know what wolves mean in this town. If anyone finds out, no one has to know." Sophie pleaded. "We can keep them in the old shed until they're stronger." "Please, Gran, they'll die without help." Helen sighed, her weathered face softening as she looked at the four tiny creatures, so vulnerable despite their heritage. "Bring them inside before anyone sees. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Sophie smiled gratefully, knowing this wasn't the end of the discussion, but at least the cubs would be warm and safe for now inside the cozy kitchen. Helen helped Sophie spread a thick blanket by the wood stove, and Sophie gently placed the cubs in this makeshift nest. "They need to be dried off," Helen said, her nurse's training from decades ago taking over. She handed Sophie a soft towel. "Rub him gently, especially the little one. He's barely moving." Sophie worked diligently, carefully drying each cub, while Helen heated some milk on the stove. The smallest cub concerned her the most. Its breathing was shallow, and it didn't resist her ministrations like the others. "Come on, little River," she whispered, having already decided on names for each of them. "Stay with us, River." Helen questioned, testing the warm milk on her wrist before handing it to Sophie in a shallow dish. "That's this one," Sophie explained, indicating the smallest cub. "The biggest one is North, the female is Aurora, and the dark one is Storm." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You're naming them already." "They need names," Sophie said, matter-of-factly dipping her finger in the milk and letting drops fall into River's mouth. To her relief, the tiny cub began to lick weakly at the offering. "Sophie," Helen said, gently sitting beside her granddaughter, "you know, we can't keep them, don't you? They're wild animals, predators, just until they're strong." Sophie pleaded. "Then we can figure something out. Maybe Officer Stevens could help relocate them somewhere safe." Helen wasn't optimistic. about the wildlife officer's potential reaction. But she nodded, "We'll see for now. Let's focus on keeping them alive through the night." As darkness fell over Whispering Pines, Sophie lay on the floor beside the stove. The 4 wolf cubs huddled against her for warmth. Their tiny bodies had stopped shivering, and even little River seemed stronger after several feedings of milk and some watered-down chicken broth. "I won't let anything happen to you," Sophie whispered to her unlikely new family. She had no way of knowing then just how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how thoroughly her act of compassion would challenge everything her community believed about wolves and about her. Outside, the spring rain continued to fall, swelling Cedar River further beyond its banks and washing away an old world to make way for a new one where the boundaries between wild and tame friend and foe would never be quite so clear again. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wolf cubs grew with astonishing speed. What had begun as 4 tiny, helpless creatures had transformed into increasingly energetic young wolves with growing appetites and louder voices. The shed, once a perfect hiding place, had become woefully inadequate as their playful wrestling matches threatened to topple Helen's gardening supplies. 3 weeks after the river rescue, Sophie stood in the doorway of the shed, watching North lead his siblings in a game of tug-off-war with an old rope toy she brought them. Her heart swelled with pride, even as anxiety gwetted her stomach. They couldn't stay here much longer. Helen appeared beside her, wiping flour covered hands on her apron. "They need more space, Sophie. And they're getting louder. Mrs. Graham asked me yesterday if I'd gotten a new dog." "What did you tell her?" Sophie asked, her eyes never leaving the cubs. "That I was pet sitting for Dr. Ramirez. But that excuse won't hold for long." Helen's voice softened as she watched the S tumble over each other. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" "Even I have to admit it." Sophie nodded, scratching behind Aurora's ears as the female cub bounded over to greet her. "I've been exploring the woods. There's an old hunter's cabin about a mile into Willow Creek Forest. Nobody's used it for years." Helen's eyebrows shot up. "Sophie, Carter, please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. It's perfect, Gran. It's got 3 walls still standing, and I can fix a 4th with branches. There's a stream nearby for water, and no hunters go there this time of year." "Absolutely not," Helen said firmly. "It's too dangerous. You can't be trapping into the deep forest every day. And those cubs will eventually grow into full-size wolves. They're wild animals." "Sophie, they're not just wild animals," Sophie protested. "They know me. They trust me." As if to prove her point, River, the smallest cub, limped over and pressed against her leg. His front paw had never fully healed from whatever injury he'd sustained in the flood, giving him a permanent, distinctive gait. Sophie picked him up, and he immediately nuzzled into her neck. "See, they're like family now." Helen's face softened momentarily before hardening again with resolve. "We need to call Officer Stevens. It's been 3 weeks. They're stronger now. He can take them to a sanctuary." "Or no." Sophie's men startled the cubs, and Storm let out a small growl. "Officer Stevens follows Mayor Thompson's orders, and everyone knows how the mayor feels about wolves. He'll either shoot them or ship them off to some horrible zoo." The G argument might have continued, but a knock at the front door sent both of them into a panic. Helen quickly closed the shed door, ushering Sophie toward the house. Not a word. She whispered urgently, "Let me hand this." Sheriff Tom Baker stood on the porch, his weathered face unreadable beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, William Ross leaned against his pickup truck, rifle visible in the gun rack behind the seat. "Morning, Helen," Sheriff Baker said, removing his hat. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Tom," Helen replied with a forced smile. "What brings you by?" "Got reports of wolf sightings near Cedar River. William here says he saw a mother wolf and at least 2 cubs yesterday while checking his traps." The sheriff's eyes moved to Sophie, who tried to make herself as small as possible behind her grandmother. "Thought I'd check with folks who live near the forest edge if they've noticed anything unusual." Helen laughed a little too brightly. "Wolves around here I haven't seen or heard a thing. Have you, Sophie?" Sophie shook her head mutely, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the sheriff must hear it. William Ross approached, his tall frame casting a shadow across the porch. With the river flooding last month, they might have been displaced from their usual territory. Wolves are getting bolder these days, coming close to town than they used to. "Well, we haven't seen any," Helen repeated firmly, "but we'll certainly keep an eye out and let you know if we do." Sheriff Baker nodded, seemingly satisfied, but William's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the property. His gaze lingered on the shed. "Got a new dog, Helen?" he asked. "Casually thought I heard barking when we pulled up." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Helen's smile never wavered. "Oh, that's just Buddy. I'm watching him for Dr. Ramirez while she's at that veterinary conference in Missoula. He's a bit skittish around strangers." So I keep him in the shed during the day. William seemed about to say more when Sheriff Baker placed a hand on his shoulder. Well, we won't keep you ladies any longer. Just be careful when you're out and about, especially near the forest. If there's a wolf pack moving, and we'll need to take action before they start threatening livestock. After they left, Helen closed the door and leaned against it, her face pale. That was too close. We need to move them tonight, Sophie said urgently. If William Ross comes back to check, Helen closed her eyes, her internal struggle evident in the tight lines around her mouth. Finally, she nodded tonight. Then, but we'll need a better plan than that old cabin. As darkness fell over Whispering Pines, Sophie and Helen worked quickly gathering supplies. Helen had reluctantly agreed that the abandoned hunter's cabin was their best option for now, but insisted on seeing it for herself. They packed enough food for several days, old blankets for bedding, and a first aid kit for River's still tender Poe. This is madness, Helen muttered as she struggled to keep up with Sophie on the forest path, flashlight beam bobbing through the darkness. If anyone finds out, they won't, Sophie insisted, clutching the makeshift carrier they constructed from an old dog crate. Inside, the four cubs whimpered softly, disturbed by the journey. We'll be careful. The cabin looked even more dilapidated than Sophie had described, a three-sided structure with the fourth wall collapsed into rotting timber. But it was secluded, hidden in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, with a promised stream bubbling nearby. This won't work for long, Helen said, as they released the cubs into their new home. When winter comes, we'll figure something out before then, Sophie promised. Watching as the cubs cautiously explored their new surroundings, North immediately claimed the highest point, a shelf formed by a fallen beam, while Aurora discovered a patch of moonlight to bask in. Storm began a methodical patrol of the perimeter, and River stayed close to Sophie, still the most dependent on human contact. How will you feed them, Helen asked, concern etching deeper lines into her face. I've been reading books about wolves, Sophie explained. Unpacking the supplies, they start eating meat. Really young, I can bring scraps from our meals, and they'll learn to hunt small animals around here. And when they get bigger, when they need more than scraps. Sophie had no answer for that. Despite her confident exterior, she knew they were inventing solutions as they went along, each one more precarious than the last. The cubs settled quickly into their new home, their adaptability surprising both Sophie and Helen. Every day after school, Sophie would make the journey to the cabin, bringing food and spending hours with her growing wolf family. She taught them simple commands, not like dogs, but more like communication between different species who respected each other. North, the silver-backed male with distinctive facial markings, established himself as the leader, always the first to investigate new things and protect his siblings. Aurora, the only female, grew sleek and beautiful, her blue-gray coat shimmering in the sunlight. Storm lived up to his name, powerful and sometimes temperamental, but fiercely loyal. And River, despite his limp, developed a keen intelligence that sometimes seemed to border on something deeper, an understanding beyond what should be possible for a wild animal. Spring gave way to early summer, and the wolves' growth accelerated. No longer cubs, they were adolescents, now awkward in their lengthening limbs, but increasingly coordinated in their play and proto-hunting behaviors. Sophie's secret became harder to keep. She disappeared for hours each day, returning with twigs in her hair and dirt on her clothes. Her only friend at school, Jessica Williams, grew suspicious of her evasive answers and constant distraction. You're hiding something, Jessica confronted her one day. As they walked home, you barely talk to me anymore, and you always rush off after school. I'm not hiding anything, Sophie lied, hating the deception, but terrified of the consequences of truth. I just like being in the forest. It helps me not miss my parents so much. Jessica's face softened at that. She knew better than most how Sophie had struggled after the accident. You can talk to me, you know, about anything, Sophie almost told her. Then the words rise into her lips like a dam about to break. How wonderful would it be to share her secret, to have a friend join her in the daily adventure of raising the wolves. But then she remembered William Ross's cold eyes and the rifle in his truck, and the moment passed. I know, she said instead. Thanks, Jess. The first wolf sighting came in early July. Peter Wilson, who owned the cattle ranch on the western edge of town, reported seeing something big moving through his north pasture at dusk. Wasn't a coyote, he insisted to Sheriff Baker. Too big, too bold. Had to be a wolf. Then the Henderson family claimed they'd spotted two wolves watching their property from the forest edge. By the end of the week, Whispering Pines buzzed with sightings and speculation. Sophie listened with growing dread as she stood in line at the general store where Helen was purchasing groceries. Never seen wolves as bold, William Ross declared to the gathered townspeople. Something's drawn them, and mark my words, should we organize a hunting party? Someone suggested not. Without proper authorization, Sheriff Baker cautioned, "Let's not overreact, wolves are territorial animals. Maybe a new pack has moved into the region." Sophie clutched her grandmother's hand, tightly willing her face to remain neutral. She knew these weren't random wolves being. Spotted her wolves were growing, becoming more curious, and despite her best efforts to keep them deep in the forest, they were beginning to explore. She needed to warn them somehow, make them understand the danger they faced if they ventured too close to town that afternoon. She rushed to the cabin. As soon as school ended, her heart pounding with anxiety, the wolves greeted her with their usual enthusiasm, but she noticed immediately that only 3 were present. "Where's Storm?" she asked, as if they could answer. "Where's your brother?" North tilted his head, seeming to understand her concern. He moved to the edge of the clearing and looked into the dense forest, letting out a low bark. Minutes passed with no response. "He's gone." "Exploring again, hasn't he?" Sophie's voice trembled. That's what Mr. Wilson saw it had to be as darkness approached, and Storm still hadn't returned. Sophie's worry morphed into full-blown panic. She couldn't leave without him, but Helen would be frantic if she didn't come home soon. Just as she was about to venture deeper into the forest, calling from a rustle in the underbrush announced Storm's return. Relief flooded through Sophie until she saw the blood on his muzzle. "What did you do?" she whispered, fear clawing at her throat. "Please tell me you didn't hunt someone's livestock." Storm approached, cautiously sensing her distress. When she didn't back away, he dropped something at her feet, a rabbit freshly killed, but otherwise untouched. He was bringing her a gift, showing off his first successful hunt. Sophie's knees went weak with relief. "Just a rabbit, thank goodness." She knelt and stroked Storm's head. "You scare me. You all have to stay away from the farms and houses. The people there will hurt you if they see you that night." Sophie struggled to sleep, her mind racing with worries. The wolves were getting bigger, their territory expanding naturally. How long before someone connected them to her? How long before the town's fear turned to active hunting? She was pulled from her restless sleep by a sudden sharp knock on the front door. The grandfather clock in the hallway showed 11:30 p.m. Far too late for casual visitors. Helen was already moving down the stairs, tying her robe as she went. Sophie crept to the landing, peering through the banister rails as her grandmother opened the door to reveal Sheriff Baker, his expression grave in the porch light. "Sorry to disturb you so late, Helen," he said, hat in hand. "But there's been an incident. One of Peter Wilson's Krez was killed tonight. Throat torn out, body partly eaten." Sophie's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. "That's terrible," Helen said, her voice admirably steady. "But what does it have to do with us?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Some folks in town have been talking about Sophie spending so much time in the woods, about strange noises coming from your property a few weeks back." "What are you implying, Tom?" Helen's voice had an edge now. "I'm not implying anything," he said quickly, "but William Ross and some others are convinced we have a wolf problem, and the mayor's called an emergency town meeting tomorrow night. I thought you should know." After the sheriff left, Helen stood motionless in the hallway for a long moment before looking up at Sophie. "On the stairs, it wasn't them," Sophie said. "Immediately Storm caught a rabbit today. They wouldn't need to attack a calf." Helen didn't look convinced. "Wolves are predators, Sophie. It's in their nature." "Not my wolves, they wouldn't." But as Sophie returned to bed, doubt crept in like a shadow. The wolves were growing, their instincts developing. Could she really be certain what they did when she wasn't with them? And if the town was mobilizing against wolves, how could she possibly keep her secret and her wolf family safe? The community hall was packed to capacity. The following evening, every resident of Whispering Pines seemed to have turned out for the emergency meeting, their faces grim. Beneath the fluorescent lights, Sophie and Helen slipped into seats at the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous. But several heads turned to stare as they entered. Mayor Robert Thompson stood at the podium, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his expression appropriately grave for the occasion. "Friends and neighbors," he began, voice echoing to the hall. "For generations, Whispering Pines has kept the wolf threat at bay through vigilance and regular hunting. But recent events suggest we're facing a new infiltration. In the past month, we've had 12 separate wolf sightings, culminating in last night's attack on Peter Wilson's livestock." Peter Wilson stood up, his weathered face flushed with anger. "That cow was worth nearly $1,000. But it's not about the money. Next time, it could be someone's pet, or worse, a child." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sophie shrank lower in her seat, Helen's hand protectively covering hers. "I've seen it with my own eyes," William Ross announced, standing tall in his hunting gear. "At least 4 wolves, maybe more, biggest I've ever seen in these parts. And they're not showing natural fear of humans. That makes them dangerous." Mayor Thompson nodded solemnly. "Thank you, William. That brings us to our response. I've spoken with state wildlife officials. They've granted us emergency Permission for a controlled hunt to eliminate the wolf threat before it escalates further. Sophie's heart seemed to stop. She half rose from her seat before Helen pulled her firmly back down, shaking her head in warning. "When do we start?" someone called out tomorrow at dawn. "The mayor," replied William Ross, "has agreed to lead the hunting party. Anyone with hunting licenses who wishes to participate should meet at the town square at 5 a.m. Sheriff Baker stepped forward, then his expression uncomfortable. "I'd like to remind everyone that we need to confirm these are actually wolves before taking action. There's been no direct evidence yet, just sightings and one predator attack. That could have been a mountain lion or even feral dogs. You calling me liar?" Sheriff Peter Wilson challenged, rising again. "I've lived with livestock my whole life. I know wolf kills when I see them." "I'm not calling anyone a liar," the sheriff replied. "Evenly, I'm just saying we should proceed with caution, Mr. David." Mitchell, Sophie's science teacher, raised his hand and was acknowledged by the mayor. "Before we rush to kill these animals, has anyone considered relocation? If they are trapped humanely, they could be moved to a wilderness area far to town." William Ross snorted derisively. "Typical outsider, thinking you've only lived here, what, 5 years? Those of us born in Whispering Pines know there's only one way to deal with wolves." That enough, Mayor Thompson interrupted. "The state has authorized lethal measures, and that's what we're implementing." Meeting adjourned as people began filing out. Mrs. Edith Graham, the elderly neighbor who lived nearest to Helen, and Sophie approached them slowly, leaning on her cane, her eyes still sharp despite her 82 years, fixed on Sophie with unsettling intensity, strange in times. She remarked, "Wolves returning after all these years, almost like the old stories coming back to life." "What old stories?" Sophie couldn't help asking, despite Helen's warning squeeze on her shoulder. Mrs. Graham's weathered face creased into a mysterious smile. "Tales my grandmother told me about children who understood the language of wolves, wolf speakers." She annulled them. Her gaze remained fixed on Sophie. "So they could call wolves from the forest with just a whistle, make them do their bidding. That's just superstition." Edith, Helen said, firmly guiding Sophie toward the door. "You know better than to fill a child's head with such nonsense." "Is it nonsense?" Mrs. Graham called after them. "Or is it that some truths are too old for modern minds to accept outside in the cool evening air?" Sophie finally gave voice to her panic. "They're going to kill them. Gran, we have to do something." "Lower your voice," Helen hissed, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "We'll figure something out, but not here back home." Sophie paced the kitchen, while Helen made tea, her mind racing through increasingly desperate scenarios. "I could hide them somewhere else," she suggested. "Maybe in the caves beyond Willow Creek." Helen shook her head. "The hunters know these forests better than you do. They'll find them. Then I'll warn them." Sophie insisted, "Make them understand they need to go deeper into the wilderness, away from town. They're wolves." Sophie, Helen said gently, "not people. They may be bonded to you in some way, but they can't understand complex instructions like that." Tears of frustration wet in Sophie's eyes. "Then what, we just let them be shot?" Helen stared into her teacup for a long moment before meeting her granddaughter's gaze. "There's one person who might be able to help, but you're not going to like." An hour later, they stood on the porch of Dr. Elena Ramirez's modest home on the outskirts of town. The veterinarian answered the door in pajama pants and a university sweatshirt, clearly surprised by late-night visitors. "Helen, Sophie, is everything all right? We need your help." Helen said simply, "May we come in?" Inside, seated around Dr. Ramirez's kitchen table, Helen recounted the whole story: the river rescue, the secret weeks of caring for the cubs, the cabin in the woods, and now the impending hunt. The veterinarian listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to concern to something approaching wonder. "You've been raising wolf cubs?" she finally asked Sophie directly. "For nearly 4 months." Sophie nodded, bracing for judgment or anger. Instead, Dr. Ramirez leaned forward, fascination evident in her dark eyes. "And they bonded with you. They recognize you, respond to you. They're like family." Sophie said simply, "Aurora always greets me first. North is protective. He watches out for everyone. Storm is the strongest, but acts tough to hide that he's actually gentle. And River," her voice caught, "River needs me the most. Is poor, never healed, right?" Dr. Ramirez glanced at Helen. "You realize how extraordinary this is. Wolves don't typically bond with humans this way, especially wild wolves not raised from birth in captivity. Extraordinary or not," Helen interjected, "they'll be dead by tomorrow night. If that hunting party finds them, can you help us?" The veterinarian ran a hand through her short, dark hair. "Thinking I have a colleague at the Northern Montana Wildlife Sanctuary. They rehabilitate injured predators, release them when possible. But even if they could take your wolves, how will we get them there? It's almost 3 hours away. My truck," Helen offered. "If we could somehow contain them safely." "They trust me," Sophie added eagerly. "I could get them into crates. if we had them, Dr. Ramirez shook her head. It's not that simple. These are nearly grown wolves, wild ones at that, even with their unusual bond to. Sophie transporting them would be dangerous, she doctor drummed her. Fingers on the table, thinking we'd need tranquilizers, a proper transport cages documentation too. Since moving wolves across county lines without permits is illegal, drain from Sophie's face. So you can't help us, I didn't say that. Dr. Ramirez corrected her. I'm saying we need a better plan than shoving 4 adolescent wolves into the back of your grandmother's pickup truck. And we need to move fast, they talked late into the night, formulating a strategy that seemed equally terrifying and brilliant. By the time Sophie and Helen left, it was past midnight, and they had less than 5 hours before the hunting party would gather. Try to sleep, Helen urged, as they arrived home tomorrow. Will be challenging enough without exhaustion, but sleep proved impossible for Sophie. She lay awake, imagining North's silver first day with blood, Aurora's graceful form crumpled in the underbrush storm, and River running for their lives as bullets whistled past them. The images were too horrific to bear at 4 o'clock a.m. She slipped out of bed and dressed quickly in the darkness. Helen was already in the kitchen, packing a small bag with food and first aid supplies ready. Her grandmother asked, the lines in her face deeper than usual in the dim light. Sophie nodded, unable to speak past a knot of fear in her throat. They drove in silence through the sleeping town past the square, where a few early arrivals of the hunting party were already gathering, rifles gleaming dully in the pre-dawn gloom. Sophie ducked down in her seat as they passed, though the darkness likely concealed her from view. Dr. Ramirez was waiting at the trailhead that led to Willow Creek Forest. Her SUV packed with equipment. Her teenage son, Tyler, stood beside her, looking nervous, but determined. Tyler's going to help us with the heavy lifting, Dr. Ramirez explained as they transfer equipment from her vehicle to backpacks. He's good with animals. I still think this is crazy, Tyler muttered, shouldering a pack that clinked with metal. Supplies if Mom loses her veterinary license over this. No one's losing anything, Dr. Ramirez assured him. We're conducting an emergency wildlife relocation with verbal authorization from state officials. The paperwork will catch up later. It was convenient fiction, but Sophie was too grateful to question it. She led the small group through the dark forest, her feet finding the familiar path by instinct more than sight. The sky was just beginning to lighten as they approached the cabin clearing. Wait. Here, Sophie whispered, let me go first. So they don't get scared, she stepped into the clearing, softly calling the name she'd given the wolves for a heart-stopping moment. There was no response. Had they somehow sensed a danger and fled already? Then North emerged from the dilapidated cabin, his silver a fur ghostly in the half-light. Aurora followed. Then Storm. Only River remained in the shadows, his caution always greater than his siblings. It's okay, Sophie called softly. These are friends. North approached her first, as always, and Sophie knelt to embrace him. His body had the lanky, not quite finished proportions of adolescence, but he was already the size of a German shepherd, his frame promising much more growth. To come, you need to trust me today, she whispered into his rough. People are coming to hurt you. We're going to take you somewhere safe, but you have to do exactly as I say. As if he understood every word, North licked her cheek once, then stood at attention, waiting for instructions. Sophie beckoned the others forward. Dr. Ramirez inhaled sharply at her first clear view of the wolves, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to a magnificence. She breathed, and so calm around you, it's remarkable. North growled low in his throat as the strangers entered his territory. Sophie placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. Friends, she repeated firmly, they're here to help. Dr. Ramirez knelt slowly, avoiding direct eye contact with the wolves, a respectful approach that Sophie appreciated. We need to work quickly, the veterinarian said. The tranquilizers won't harm them, but they'll need time to recover before we move them. Sophie nodded, though the thought of drugging her wolves made her uneasy. She helped Dr. Ramirez prepare the injection equipment, while Tyler and Helen set up the collapsible transport cages they'd brought. Start with the most dominant, Dr. Ramirez advised. Once he accepts it, the others will be easier. Sophie approached North's syringe hidden behind her back. I'm sorry, she whispered, stroking his head with her free hand. This will help keep you safe. As Dr. Ramirez had predicted, North's cooperation made the others follow suit. Within 20 minutes, all 4 wolves were sedated, their massive forms peaceful in artificial slumber. River had been the most difficult, cowering in the back of the cabin, until Sophie actually had to carry him out. His trust in her overcoming his fear of the strangers. They worked efficiently, loading each wolf into a transport cage. Tyler proved surprisingly strong for his age, helping Dr. Ramirez with the heavier males, while Sophie and Helen managed Aurora and River. Now for the hard part, Dr. Ramirez said, wiping sweat from her brow. Despite The morning chill getting them back to the vehicles. Without being seen, they had just secured the last cage when the distant sound of voices reached them through the trees. The hunting party, Helen, whispered, face paling. They must have picked up the trill Sophie's blood ran cold. William Ross was an experienced hunter, and he'd been suspicious of her all along, of course. He would lead the party straight to the cabin. We need to split up, Dr. Ramirez decided. Quickly, 2 cages, each different routes back to the trailhead, but the wolves Sophie began will be fine. The veterinarian assured her sedation will last at least another hour. The important thing is to move quickly and stay out of sight. They paired off Dr. Ramirez with Tyler, taking north, and Storm Helen, and Sophie with Aurora and River. Each pair headed in different directions, trying to circle around where the voices seemed to be coming from. Sophie's strain under River's, a cage lighter than the others but still unwieldy on the rough forest terrain. Helen wasn't faring much better with. Aurora, her arthritic hands white-knuckled on the handle grip, stop at rest a moment. Sophie urged, seeing her grandmother's labored breathing. Helen shook her head stubbornly. No time, those hunters are getting closer. They pressed on the voices behind them, growing louder, occasionally punctuated by the crash of underbrush. As the hunting party moved through the forest, Sophie's heart pounded in her ears, her arms burning with exertion. River stirred slightly in his cage, beginning to emerge from the sedation. She soothed, just a little longer, boy. They had almost reached a wider trail that would lead them back to the vehicles when Helen stumbled, crying out softly as she fell to one knee. Aurora's cage landed with a dull thud that seemed deafening in the tense silence. Grand Sophie carefully sat down River's cage and rushed to her grandmother's side. I'm fine, Helen insisted, though her face was contorted with pain. Just twisted my ankle, help me up. Before Sophie could respond, a shout rang out. Behind them over there, I heard something. Heavy footsteps crashed through the undergrowth, heading directly toward them. Helen struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on Sophie. Leave me, she urged. Take the wolves and go. I'll distract them. I'm not leaving you, Sophie said, fiercely, looking around desperately for someone to hide. But the forest provided no convenient shelter, and the cages were too bulky to conceal. Quickly, Aurora was fully awake now, her blue-gray eyes alert as she sensed the danger. She whined softly, pressing against the bars of her cage as it tried to reach Sophie. The footsteps grew louder, and Sophie made a split-second decision. She unlatched Aurora's cage. Run, she whispered to the wolf deep into the forest. Don't stop. Aurora hesitated, looking from Sophie to Helen, as if torn between freedom and loyalty. Sophie made a sharp gesture, and finally the wolf slipped away into the trees, a gray shadow vanishing into deeper shadow. Sophie turned to River's cage next, but before she could open it, William Ross burst into clearing, rifle raised. 2 other hunters flanked him, their expressions changing from triumph to confusion as they took in the scene a small girl, an elderly woman, and a caged wolf. What in God's name? One of the hunters began. William's face darkened with fury as understanding dawned. I knew it, he spat. I knew there was something unnatural going on. The wolf girl of Whispering Pines. He advanced on them, rifle still at the ready, step away from that cage girl. That animal is dangerous. The only dangerous animals here are the ones holding guns, Helen retorted, placing herself between Sophie and the hunters. Despite her injured ankle, William ignored her, his cold eyes fixed on Sophie. So you've been hiding them all along, harboring predators that kill our livestock and threaten our town. They never hurt anyone, Sophie protested. The calf wasn't them. They were with me that night. Lying won't save them, William sneered. Or you. He raised his radio to his lips. Ross, here we found a WF den, and you won't believe who's been keeping them as pets. Send the sheriff to the East Trail crossing. As he lowered the radio, a low growl emerged from River's cage. The sedation was wearing off, and the small wolf was alert now, his amber eyes locked on William, teeth bared in a snarl. Seems this one's eager to demonstrate how dangerous they are, William remarked, raising his rifle again. No, Sophie threw herself in front of the aged. Please, he's hurt. He has a bad paw, he can't hurt anyone. One of the other hunters shifted uncomfortably. Come on, well, she's just a kid. Let the sheriff handle this. William's jaw tightened, but he lowered his rifle slightly. Fine, but that wolf isn't going anywhere except 6 feet. Underneath her are its siblings. Once we find them. Sophie stared up at him, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady with conviction. You're wrong about them, about all wolves. They're not the monsters you think they are. Move aside, girl, William ordered his patience. Clearly wearing thin, Sophie didn't budge. No, the standoff might have escalated further, but the sound of more people approaching interrupted them. Sheriff Baker emerged from the trees, followed by Dr. Ramirez, and Mayor Thompson. Behind them came Mr. Mitchell, the science teacher, looking worried, but determined. What's going on here? The sheriff demanded, taking the scene with a practiced eye. William gestured angrily toward Sophie and the cage wolf. She's been hiding them, raising them like pets, and this. Betty spat the word like a curse, helping her transport dangerous predators. Dr. Ramirez stepped forward, her professional demeanor firmly in place. As a town veterinarian, I'm conducting a wildlife relocation with proper authorization. These wolves were orphaned during the spring floods and are being transferred to Northern Montana Wildlife Sanctuary proper authorization. Mayor Thompson scoffed. I've authorized no such thing wildlife. Management falls under state jurisdiction, not local. Dr. Ramirez counted smoothly. I've been in contact with state officials. Sheriff Baker looked from the veterinarian to Sophie, then to River, who had calmed somewhat in his cage, but still watched the proceedings with away eyes. Is this true, Sophie? He asked. You found these wolves during the floods? Sophie nodded, her chin raised defiantly despite her fear. They were drowning. Their mother was gone, probably swept away. I couldn't let them die. Mr. Mitchell moved to stand beside Sophie. I've studied wolf behavior for years. If these animals were raised with human contact from such a young age, they form unique bonds. It would explain why they haven't exhibited typical predatory behavior toward humans. Tell that to Peter Wilson's dead cow William Snap, there was no evidence linking that kill specifically to wolves. Sheriff Baker reminded him. Could have been mountain lions, coyotes, even feral dogs. Mayor Thompson surveyed the scene with growing discomfort, clearly torn between his anti-wolf stance and the reality of a 10-year-old girl defending a caged animal against armed men. Where are the others? He finally asked. Safe. Dr. Ramirez answered before Sophie could speak. On their way to the sanctuary, where they belong, all except Aurora. Sophie added quietly, I let her go when we heard the hunters coming. William swore under his breath. So there's still a wolf running loose in our forest. She needs to be tracked down. And what? Helen interrupted, her voice steely, despite her physical pain, shot for the crime of existing. That wolf has never harmed anyone. A tense silence fell over the clearing. River winded softly in his cage, seeming to sense a precarious balance of his fate. Sophie reached through the bars to stroke his head, drawing comfort from his familiar presence. Even she tried to comfort him. Look at them, Mr. Mitchell said softly. That's not a wild animal snarling for blood. That a bond of trust. Sheriff Baker removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair as he considered the situation. The hunting party is disbanded. He finally declared, at least until we sort this out properly. You can't do that, William, protested the mayor. Authorized. I'm the law in this county. The sheriff cut him off firmly. And I'm not about to let a child be traumatized or an animal killed unnecessarily until we've established the facts. He turned to Dr. Ramirez. You said something about a wildlife sanctuary. The veterinarian nodded. They have expert wolf handlers and a 3,000-acre natural habitat. The wolves can live there safely away from human settlements. Then that's where this one goes to. Sheriff Baker decided, gesturing to River, but I want proper documentation, and I'll be making some calls to verify your authorization. Relief flooded through Sophie, so intense she felt her knees might buckle. She looked down at River, whose amber eyes reflected complete trust despite the stress of the situation. You'll be with your brothers soon, she whispered, and maybe Aurora will find her way to you too. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat uncomfortably. This doesn't change the town's position on wolves in general. He insisted. If more move into the area, then we'll handle it properly. Mr. Mitchell interjected with science and respect, not fear and bullets. As the adults continued discussing logistics, Sophie remained beside River's cage, her hand not leaving his fur. She had won this battle. Her wolves would live, but at what cost? Lost. A secret that had bound them together was exposed now, and the sanctuary, while safe, was hours away. Would she ever see them again? Helen limped to her granddaughter's side, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. You did a brave thing today, she murmured. I'm proud of you. Sophie leaned against her grandmother, exhaustion finally catching up with her. What happens now? She asked, her voice small. Helen looked around at the dissipating tension in the clearing. Dr. Ramirez directing the careful loading of River's cage. Sheriff Baker keeping a watchful eye on William. Ross. Mr. Mitchell engaging the mayor in earnest conversation about wildlife management practices. Now, Helen said with a gentle squeeze, we learn to live with the consequences of compassion, and perhaps teach others to do the same. As they prepare to transport River to join his brothers, Sophie gazed into the forest where Aurora had disappeared. She raised her hand in a silent farewell, hoping that somewhere in the vast wilderness her wolf friend was running free, and that someday somehow their paths would cross again. Little did she know then how prophetic that hope would prove to be, or how dramatically their reunion would transform the future of Whispering Pines. 5 years passed like leaves carried on a swift current. Sophie Carter grew from a small, defiant 10-year-old into a thoughtful, quietly confident teenager. Whispering Pines remained largely unchanged. The bronze hunter statue still dominated the town square. The Hunters' Festival continued each November, and wolves were still spoken with a mixture of fear and disdain. But beneath this veneer of constancy subtle shifts had occurred. The story of Sophie's wool wolves had become local legend, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed the wolves had been unnaturally intelligent, capable of understanding human speech. Others insisted they had protected Sophie from a mountain lion. Once, though no evidence supported this embellishment, the most dramatic versions suggested Sophie could control the wolves with her mind, a notion that made the now 15-year-old roll her eyes whenever she overheard it they make. "It sounded like I was commanding a wolf army," she complained to Helen one evening as they washed dishes together. "They were just orphan cubs I helped raise. Nothing magical about that." Helen smiled, her hands now more gnarled by arthritis, but still capable of most daily tasks. "People need stories to make sense of things that challenge their beliefs. It's easier to think you had special powers than to accept that wolves aren't the monsters they believe them to be." The sanctuary had sent updates for the first year. After relocating Northstorm and River, the wolves had adapted well to their new environment, remaining together as a tight-knit pack despite being introduced to other wolves. Dr. Michael Anderson, the wildlife biologist who managed the sanctuary, had been fascinated by their unusual socialization and published a paper about it in a scientific journal. After that first year, the updates became less frequent, then stopped altogether. When Sophie inquired, she received a polite form letter explaining that the sanctuary no longer tracked individual animals once they fully integrated into the wilderness habitat. It was better this way, the letter explained, allowing them to live as truly wild wolves. As for Aurora, there had been occasional reports of a solitary blue-gray wolf in the forest surrounding Whispering Pines. William Ross claimed to have spotted her twice near his hunting grounds, but never managed to get a shot, something Sophie silently celebrated whenever she heard his frustrated account at the general store. Sophie never spoke of how often she still ventured into the woods, hiking to the old cabin, or sitting by Cedar River at the spot where she found the cubs. Sometimes she imagined she caught a glimpse of Aurora watching from the shadows, but the wolf never approached. Perhaps she had truly returned to her wild nature, or perhaps she had traveled north to somehow reunite with her brothers. Sophie preferred to believe the latter life had continued its inexorable forward motion. Sophie excelled in school, particularly in biology and environmental sciences. Mr. Mitchell, now the high school science teacher, encouraged and encouraged her interest, lending her books about wildlife conservation and occasionally arranging for her to assist Dr. Ramirez with animal care at the veterinary clinic. Not everything had improved. William Ross still glared whenever he saw Sophie in town. Mayor Thompson had narrowly won re-election by doubling down on his traditional values platform, which included maintaining the annual wolf hunt in areas where it remained legal, and Sophie still found herself existing on the periphery of the town's social life. Her reputation as the wolf girl making her an object of curiosity rather than friendship. Jessica Williams remained her only close friend, loyal despite the occasional teasing she endured by association. "Let them talk," Jessica would say with a dismissive toss of her blonde ponytail. "They're just jealous because your life has been interesting." On a crisp autumn morning 5 years to the day since the confrontation in the forest, Sophie hiked alone to Cedar River. The anniversary always pulled her back to where it had begun, a private pilgrimage to honor the connection that had shaped her young life. The river flowed peacefully within its banks, giving no hint of the raging torrent it became during spring floods. Sophie sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching the clear water ripple over smooth stones, lost in memories. A twig snapped behind her. Sophie turned, expecting to see another hiker, or perhaps a deer. Instead, she found herself looking into the amber eyes of a wolf. For a heartbeat neither moved. The wolf stood at the forest edge, its blue-gray fur unmistakable. Even after 5 years, Aurora, Sophie whispered, hardly daring to believe the wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. She took a hesitant step towards Sophie, then another, her movements cautious but purposeful. Sophie remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing. After 5 years in the wild, Aurora would be a fully mature wolf with fully developed instincts. Any sudden movement might startle her. Slowly, with deliberate grace, Aurora closed the distance between them. When she was just 2 feet away, she stopped and sat regarding Sophie with eyes that seemed to hold memories impossible for a wild animal. "You remember me?" Sophie said softly, not a question, but a statement of wonder. Aurora tilted her head, then leaned forward to sniff Sophie's outstretched hand. The warm breath against her palm broke something inside Sophie, and tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "I've missed "You so much," he whispered, as if understanding. Aurora moved closer, allowing Sophie to gently touch her head. The wolf's fur was coarser than Sophie remembered, her frame larger and more powerful. This was no longer the playful cub who had tumbled around the cabin floor, but a mature predator who had survived 5 winters on her own. Yet, as Aurora leaned into Sophie's, touched the connection between them remained undeniable, transformed perhaps, but unbroken by time or separation. They sat together by the river for nearly an hour, the quiet communion, requiring no words or explanations. When Aurora finally stood and shook herself, Sophie knew their reunion was ending. "Will you come back?" she asked, knowing how foolish it was to expect an answer from a wolf. Aurora gazed at her for a long moment, then turned and trotted toward the forest at the tree line. She paused and looked back once, as if fixing Sophie's image in her memory, before disappearing into the shadows. Sophie returned to town with her heart lighter than it had been in years. Even if Aurora never returned, the knowledge that she was alive and remembered their bond was enough. The following morning brought the unwelcome news that wildlife officials had approved an expanded hunting area that would include portions of forest where wolf sightings had recently increased, precisely the area where Sophie had encountered Aurora. "They can't do this," Sophie protested at the breakfast table, brandishing the newspaper article that land borders the national forest. It should be protected, Helen sighed, setting down her coffee cup. "They can if enough landowners agree, and according to this, Gregory Harris's development company now owns most of that tract." Gregory Harris had arrived in Whispering Pines 3 years earlier, buying up properties and land with grand promises of bringing progress to the sleepy mountain town. His vision included luxury cabins for wealthy vacationers, a golf course, and a wilderness experience resort that would ironically require clearing significant portions of actual wilderness. "This can't be a coincidence," Sophie muttered. "Aurora shows up again, and suddenly they're expanding the hunting zone to exactly where she's living. The world doesn't revolve around you and your wolf." "Sophie," Helen chided gently, "Harris has been pushing for this approval for months." But Sophie couldn't shake the suspicion that something more targeted was happening. After school, she detoured to Dr. Ramirez's clinic, hoping the veterinarian might have insight or advice. The waiting room was empty, except for Mrs. Graham's ancient tabby cat, sleeping in a carrier. Dr. Ramirez emerged from the backroom lab coat, spotted with what looked suspiciously like skunk spray. "Sophie, perfect timing. Want to help me with a very pungent patient?" Despite her preoccupation, Sophie smiled. "That depends. Do you have enough tomato juice to go around?" 20 minutes later, a half-bathed skunk safely contained in both human, smelling strongly of tom juice. Sophie finally explained her concern about the expanded hunting zone. Dr. Ramirez's expression grew serious. "I heard about the approval. It's troubling, especially since that area has some of the healthiest forest ecosystems in the region." She peeled off her latex gloves with a snap. "But I'm more concerned about you saying Aurora has returned. Are you certain it was her?" Positive. Sophie insisted. "She remembered me." "Dr. Ramirez, she let me touch her." The veterinarian's eyebrows rose. "That's extremely unusual behavior for a wild wolf, even one with past human contact." She studied Sophie thoughtfully. "This connection you have with these animals has always been remarkable. What can I do to protect her? The hunting season starts in 2 weeks' drive." Ramirez sighed. "Legally, not much. That land is now privately owned, and Harris has the right to allow hunting on it." She paused and added reluctantly, "Your best hope would be if Aurora has moved on by then. Wolves can range over huge territories." But Sophie knew Aurora wouldn't leave. After 5 years, she had returned for a reason, and something told Sophie that reason was connected to her. The wolf was trying to tell her something. She just couldn't decipher what. That night, Sophie dreamed of fire flames consumed the forest around Cedar River, and through the smoke and heat, she could hear wolves howling, not in fear, but in warning. She woke, gasping the smell of smoke, so vivid she checked the house for signs of fire before realizing it was just a lingering skunk and tomato juice odor. From her clothes, the dream left her uneasy of her boing she couldn't shake. Over the next week, she hiked to the river daily, hoping for another glimpse of Aurora, but the wolf remained elusive. Then came the news that shifted everything. Gregory Harris's development company had begun clearing the forest tract 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Before hunting season even began, heavy machinery rumbled at the edge of town, carving access roads through pristine woodland and toppling centuries-old trees. Sophie watched from a ridge overlooking the devastation, her hands clenched into helpless fists. Jessica stood beside her, having insisted on coming along despite Sophie's distracted mood all week. "It's awful," Jessica acknowledged, following Sophie's gaze to where yellow bulldozers push piles of uprooted vegetation. "But maybe it'll drive the wolves further away, keep them safe from the hunters, or push them closer to town where they'll be shot on sight." Sophie counted Bitterly, they're destroying everything. Not just trees, entire habitats, wildlife corridors, denning sites. I know, Jessica said softly, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder, but what can we do? Harris owns the land. Sophie had no answer, but the sick feeling in her stomach intensified as they turned to head back to town. It wasn't until they rounded a bend in the trail that they spotted him, William Ross, rifle slung over his shoulder, methodically checking a line of traps. He'd set along the forest edge. Sophie froze, pulling Jessica behind a large pine tree. 5 years had done nothing to soften her distrust of the hunter who had nearly killed River. What's he doing, Jessica? Whispered. Hunting season hasn't started yet. Trapping is allowed year-round for certain predators. Sophie whispered back. Coyotes, foxes. She didn't need to add wolves to the list. They watched as Ross knelt to just a large steel trap, carefully concealing it under leaves and forest debris. Something about his methodical movement sent a chill down Sophie's spine. These weren't standard traps. They were much larger, with wicked-looking teeth designed not just to catch, but to maim. Those are illegal, Sophie breathed, recognizing the design from one of Mr. Mitchell's wildlife management lectures. Those jaw traps were banned years ago. We should tell Sheriff Baker. Jessica suggested. Sophie nodded. But before they could retreat, Ross's head snapped up. He peered in their direction, his weathered face narrowing with suspicion. Who's there? He called, reaching for his rifle. Sophie and Jessica remained perfectly still, barely breathing. For a terrible moment, Sophie thought he would come investigate, but then his radio crackled with a voice she recognized as Victor Coleman, one of the men who sometimes joined Ross on hunting expeditions. Will you? There, we got a situation at the North Ridge. Ross grabbed his radio. What kind of situation? Harris's crew found tracks, big ones, and fur caught on some broken branches. A slow smile spread across Ross's face. Wolf sign. Looks like it. Blue-gray fur. Might be that female that escaped 5 years back. Sophie's blood ran cold if Ross and his cronies were specifically tracking Aurora. Hold position, Ross instructed through the radio. I'll bring the special equipment. He gathered his gear with swift efficiency, no longer concerned with the noise that caught his attention. Within minutes, he had disappeared up the trail toward the North Ridge, exactly where Sophie had last seen Aurora. We have to warn her, Sophie said, already moving in the opposite direction from Ross Warren, who Jessica asked, hurrying to keep up the wolf. Sophie, you can't just. I have to try. Sophie cut her off. You go tell Sheriff Baker about the illegal traps. I'll meet you back in town. Jessica hesitated, clearly torn between concern for a friend and recognition of the urgency. Be careful, she finally said. Ross is dangerous. So am I when it comes to protecting my family. Sophie replied, a steely determination in her voice that made her sound far older than 15. As Jessica headed toward town, Sophie plunged deeper into the forest, following a route she hoped would intercept Aurora before Ross and his special equipment could. The forest felt wrong today, too quiet, with an underlying tension that resonated with Sophie's own fear. She reached a small clearing and stopped, listening intently. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of construction equipment from Harris's development, but closer at hand was only silence. No bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, the telltale stillness that indicated a predator's presence. Aurora, Sophie called softly, turning slowly to scan the surrounding trees. Where are you, girl? A flash of movement caught her eye, not the blue-gray fur she sought, but something darker moving with purpose through the shadows. Sophie tensed, suddenly aware she was being watched by more than one set of eyes. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. Aurora wasn't alone. After 5 long years in the wilderness, she had returned to Whispering Pines with a purpose far greater than a simple reunion with the human who had once saved her. As Sophie stood motionless in the clearing, the shapes around her solidified into forms she would recognize anywhere. Wolves, at least 6 of them, emerging from the forest like ghosts, and at their center, moving with the dignity of a queen among her subjects, was Aurora. The blue-gray wolf approached Sophie directly, her amber eyes reflecting intelligence that transcended mere animal instinct. Behind her came a massive black male, clearly the alpha of this new pack. The others maintained a respectful distance, watching Sophie with cautious curiosity. You found a family, Sophie whispered, understanding flooding through her. You came back to show me. Aurora stopped just a few feet away, then did something that stole Sophie's breath. She turned and looked deliberately toward the North Ridge where Ross and his companions were hunting her, then back to Sophie with an intensity that conveyed clear meaning, a warning not for herself, but for Sophie. The distant crack of a branch breaking underfoot galvanized Sophie into action. They're coming, she said urgently. You need to go, all of you. It's not safe here anymore. Aurora held her gaze for one more moment, then turned and loped into the forest, her pack Following like shadows the black alpha, male lingered longest studying Sophie with unnerving focus before finally turning to follow his mate. Sophie watched them vanish. An inexplicable mix of joy and dread settling in her chest. Aurora had survived, had thrived, had found love, and created a family, everything Sophie could have. Hope for her, but she had also returned to territory that was rapidly becoming deadly ground with men like Ross and Harris, destroying what little safe haven remained. As she made her way back toward town, Sophie's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. The wolves had returned, and with them her purpose. 5 years ago, she had saved 4 drowning cubs from a raging river. Now she would save their descendants from the flood of progress threatening to eradicate them, no matter what it took. What she couldn't possibly know was how soon her conviction would be tested, or how dramatically Aurora and her pack would repay an old debt. When disaster struck Whispering Pines, the following weeks brought an uneasy tension to Whispering Pines. Gregory Harris accelerated his development plans, bringing in additional heavy equipment and crews who worked from dawn until dusk, transforming the once pristine forest into a muddy construction site. The constant noise drove wildlife deeper into the remaining wilderness, all except Aurora's pack, which seemed to maintain a deliberate presence at the periphery of town. Sheriff Baker had investigated illegal traps, Jessica reported, but found them removed by the time he arrived. William Ross denied any knowledge, feigning offense at the accusation, been hunting these woods 40 years. He told the sheriff within Sophie's earshot at the general store never needed illegal traps to catch might prey. The pointed look he shot Sophie conveyed his real message. He knew she had spotted him, and he wasn't about to let a teenager interfere with his hunting plans. Autumn deepened toward winter, painting the mountains with brilliant oranges and reds. Before stripping the trees bare, Sophie divided her time between school, helping Helen at home, and surreptitious trips to the forest edge to monitor Aurora's pack. She rarely saw the wolves directly, but found evidence of their presence: tracks in mud, tufts of fur on brambles, the remains of a deer carcass cleaned of. Meet Mr. Mitchell noticed her preoccupation during biology class. After bell rang, he asked her to stay behind. "You seem distracted lately," he said, perching on the edge of his desk. "Everything all right at home?" Sophie hesitated. Mr. Mitchell had been supportive during the wolf rescue years ago, but she wasn't sure how much to reveal about Aurora's return. "Just worried about the forest," she said carefully. "Harris's development is destroying so much habitat." Mr. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. "It's hard to watch. I filed complaints with the state environmental office, but without evidence of endangered species in the area, there's little legal recourse." Sophie nearly blurted out that wolves had returned to the area, but caution held her tongue. Wolves weren't endangered in Montana, and revealing their presence might only accelerate hunting efforts. "Is there anything that could stop the development?" she asked instead, "short of Harris going bankrupt." Mr. Mitchell smiled wryly. "Not much," although he paused. "Considering something as permits requires certain environmental safeguards, if someone were to document violations, improper waste dispose, also unauthorized clearing beyond permit boundaries, that sort of thing, it might force a work stoppage." Sophie straightened, an idea forming. How would someone document that? Photographs dated and geotagged multiple instances showing a pattern of negligence. Mr. Mitchell gave her a measuring look, but it would need to be done legally from public land or with permission. Trespassing on a construction site is dangerous and against the law. Of course, Sophie agreed a bit too quickly. Mr. Mitchell sighed. "Sophie, I know that. Look, whatever you're planning, I'm not planning anything," she assured him, gathering her books. "But hypothetically, if someone wanted to protect the forest, now they know how she left before." He could object further, her mind racing with possibilities. If she could document violations at the development site, it might buy time for Aurora's pack to move to safer territory before winter fully set in. That evening, she borrowed Helen's digital camera under the pretext of a school photography project. The next day, after school, instead of taking her usual path to monitor the wolf pack, Sophie circled around to approach Harris's development from the south, where it bordered public land. The devastation was even worse. Up close, what had been a vibrant forest ecosystem was now a scarred landscape of mud, tree stumps, and construction debris. Heavy machinery sat idle for the night, the workers having to part with the fading daylight. Sophie stayed on public land, using the camera zoom to document what she suspected were violations. Trash dumped in what looked like a seasonal creek bed, trees marked with conservation ribbons, nevertheless coupled silt fences meant to control erosion, lying damaged and ineffective. She was so focused on capturing evidence that she didn't notice the approaching vehicle until headlights swept across her position. Sophie ducked behind a Large pine heart hammering as a pickup truck rumbled to a stop at the site's edge. William Ross stepped out, followed by two men Sophie recognized as Victor Coleman and Keith Murphy, his regular hunting companions. They weren't carrying rifles, but something about their furtive movements suggested they weren't there on official business. Harris said to set them along this perimeter. Ross instructed opening the truck bed to reveal several large metal objects. Once this area cleared of predators before they start the resort landscaping next week, Sophie raised the camera, zooming in as the men unloaded what she now recognized as more illegal jaw traps, at least a dozen, far more dangerous than what she'd seen Ross setting earlier. Thought hunting season didn't start till next week, Murphy commented, struggling with the weight of a particularly large trap. Ross snorted. Harris doesn't care about seasons. He's paying us to make sure no wolves are around to scare his precious future, clients called it. Preemptive wildlife management. Still don't like these traps, Coleman muttered. Animal could suffer for days before dying. That's the point, Ross replied. Coldly, word gets around and the wild one wolf dies. Screaming, the others learn to stay away. Sophie's stomach churned to the callousness, but she steadied her hands, continuing to photograph the men setting their cruel devices. When they moved deeper into construction site, she carefully retreated, determined to get her evidence to Sheriff Baker. Immediately, she hadn't gone 20 feet when her foot caught on an exposed route, sending her stumbling forward. With a startled cry, the camera flew from her grasp, landing with a crack against a rock. Who's there? Ross's voice rang out, followed by the beam of a powerful flashlight. Sweeping the trees, Sophie scrambled to retrieve the camera and ran, no longer concerned with silence. Behind her, she heard shouts and the sound of pursuit crashing through the underbrush. It's that Carter girl, Ross called to his companions. Don't let her get away. Sophie's knowledge of the forest paths gave her an initial advantage, but the men knew these woods too, and their longer legs quickly narrowed the gap. A fallen tree blocked her usual route, forcing her to veer onto unfamiliar terrain that sloped steeply downward in the growing darkness. She misjudged a step and suddenly found herself sliding down a muddy embankment. She landed hard at the bottom pane, shooting through her ankle. The camera, miraculously still intact, had slipped inside her jacket during the fall. Voices approached from above. Sophie tried to stand but collapsed as her injured ankle gave way. She was trapped with Ross and his friends moments away from discovering her. A low growl from the shadows to her left froze. Sophie, mid-attempt, amber eyes reflected the dim moonlight. Not just one pair, but several surrounding her in a semicircle. Aurora emerged first, her blue-gray coat almost silver. In the moonlight, she moved to Sophie's side, positioning herself between the injured girl and the approaching men. The black alpha male appeared next, followed by 4 other wolves, all taking defensive positions around Sophie. Ross's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tableau below. A teenage girl, surrounded by wolves that, rather than threatening her, appeared to be protecting her. What in God's name? Coleman breathed, his voice carrying the night air. Shoot them, Ross ordered, reaching for the pistol he kept holstered at his hip. We don't have rifles, Murphy protested. Just a handgun. You can't take down 6 of wolves with that. Aurora snarled, the sound echoing off the ravine walls. The other wolves joined in creating a threatening chorus that made even Ross hesitate. They're protecting her, Coleman said incredulously, like she's one of their pack. Sophie knew the standoff couldn't last. Eventually, Ross would overcome surprise and use his pistol, likely killing Aurora. Before the wolves could react, go, she whispered urgently to Aurora. Please go now. Aurora's ears flicked back, registering Sophie's voice, but she held her ground. A black alpha for male moved closer to Sophie, his massive body a living shield above them. Ross raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Aurora. Freaks of nature, he muttered. Should have killed you years ago. Before he could pull the trigger, new lights appeared on the ridge above, flashlight beams accompanied by authoritative voices. Sheriff Department. Lower your weapon, Ross. Sheriff Baker emerged from the trees, accompanied by 2 deputies. And surprisingly, Mr. Mitchell. Ross reluctantly lowered his gun, his expression murderous. Those wolves were about to attack. He protested. Looks to me like they're protecting the girl, Sheriff. Baker counted carefully, making his way down the slope. The wolves tensed but held their positions as he approached Sophie. Are you hurt? The sheriff called. My ankle, she replied, wincing as she tried again to stand. I think it's sprained. Sheriff Baker nodded to one of his deputies, who began to descend, only to freeze when the wolves growled in unison. They won't let you near her, Mr. Mitchell observed from the ridge. Sophie, can you tell him it's okay? Sophie looked at Aurora, the wolf's eyes reflecting intelligence far beyond what most would credit. To a wild animal, it's okay, she said softly, stroking Aurora's head. They're here to help. Amazingly, the wolves settled, though they maintained a protective circle. As the deputy reached Sophie and examined her ankle, definitely sprained, he reported, we'll need to carry her up. What followed was one of the strangest rescues in Whispering Pin's history as sheriff's deputy, carrying a teenage girl up a muddy slope, while 6 wild wolves escorted them, maintaining a watchful perimeter that kept Ross and his companions at a weary distance at the top. Mr. Mitchell explained how they had arrived just in time. Jessica came to me worried when Sophie didn't come home, said something about Sophie investigating a construction site. When we couldn't find her, I called Sheriff Baker. Lucky for me, Sophie said, wincing as the deputy set her down on a fallen log. And lucky I got this. She pulled the camera from inside her jacket, evidence of raw setting. Illegal traps on Harris's order, ERS, and environmental violations all over the construction site. Sheriff Baker took the camera, his expression grave. That a serious accusation, Sophie. I have the proof right there. She insisted photos of them unloading the traps, setting them. Ross admitted Harris hired them to kill wolves before hunting season. The sheriff turned to Ross and the companions, who stood sullenly under the watchful eyes of the second deputy. Is this true? William Ross's stony silence was answer enough. Coleman, less hardened, nodded reluctantly. Harris paid cash, said he needed to clear out the wildlife before his investors visited. Next week, it should have been a moment of triumph for Sophie, but she was distracted by Aurora and her pack still hovering at the edge of the group. The wolves seemed unusually agitated, pacing and occasionally looking skyward. Mr. Mitchell noticed, too, something's bothering them. He observed quietly, as if on cue, a gust of wind brought a scent that made everyone stiffen. Smoke strong and acrid, not the pleasant aroma of a campfire, but the overwhelming smell of a forest ablaze. Sheriff Baker's radio crackled to life. Sheriff, we've got a situation. Fire reported at the north end of Harris's development. High winds pushing it toward town in the distance. An orange glow was now visible through the trees, growing brighter by the moment. The forest fire that had existed only in Sophie's nightmares had become a terrifying reality. Probably construction equipment left running, one of the deputies suggested, with all this dry underbrush. Everyone back to town. Sheriff Baker ordered, we need to coordinate evacuation. If that fire keeps spreading, he pointed at Ross and his companion. You 3 are coming with us. Those allegations will need to be addressed, but right now public safety is a priority. As the group moved quickly toward the vehicles parked nearby, Sophie turned to find Aurora still watching her.